Churchill only wages this war against the German people to save the British Empire.
He was one of Germany's most respected military minds. He helped rebuild the German army after World War I, and he came terrifyingly close to stopping Hitler before it was too late. This is the real story of Ludwig Beck, the general who risked it all to defy the Nazi regime from within. Long before Ludwig Beck became a symbol of resistance, he was just a young man following a path of discipline and duty. Born on June 29, 1880, in the town of Biebrich, now part of modern-day Germany, his early life was shaped by structure. His father, Ludwig Georg Ernst Beck, was an industrialist with a strong presence in local affairs. That sense of responsibility and order filtered down to young Ludwig, who grew up believing that service to his country was one of the highest callings a man could have. At 18, Beck joined the German army. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't crave attention. What set him apart was his sharp mind, quiet focus, and ability to think strategically. As World War I broke out in 1914, Beck wasn't charging into battle. Instead, he worked behind the scenes as a staff officer on the Western Front, helping organize movements, analyze situations, and plan operations. Surrounded by the chaos of war, he didn't see it as something heroic or romantic. To Beck, war was a matter of logistics, coordination, and making the right decisions at the right time. While others chased medals, he focused on outcomes, and that mindset would define his entire career. After Germany's defeat in 1918, the country's military was left in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped it down to just 100,000 men and banned the general staff, the brain behind Germany's military planning. Many officers left, unsure of their future in this broken system. But Ludwig Beck stayed. While the army shrank and restructured under the new name Reichswehr, Beck quietly continued working behind the scenes. The general staff didn't disappear. It simply changed its name to the Truppenamt. It was a disguise, but an effective one, and Beck played a major role in keeping Germany's military knowledge alive, even when the world thought it had been shut down. By 1931, Beck's talent was impossible to ignore. He was picked to lead a team of officers tasked with rewriting the German army's entire tactical playbook. What they had produced was Truppenführung, a military manual that would go on to change the way wars were fought. But this wasn't just about formations or commands. Beck's vision was deeper. He pushed for flexibility, encouraging officers to think for themselves and make decisions based on the bigger picture, not just follow orders blindly. He believed real leadership came from understanding the goal, not just executing a task. That thinking laid the foundation for what would later be known as Blitzkrieg, but its core idea wasn't speed, it was smart leadership at every level. The impact of Truppenführung reached far beyond Germany, influencing military doctrine in countries like Britain, France, and the US. Beck had quietly helped write one of the most important military texts of the 20th century, and the world was already starting to notice. By the time Hitler and the Nazis took control in 1933, Ludwig Beck was already a well-known name in military circles. That same year, he was appointed to lead the Truppenamt, the disguised version of the old general staff. And just 2 years later, in 1935, he climbed even higher, becoming chief of the general staff of the German army. On paper, that might have seemed like a step behind the commander-in-chief, but in reality, Beck now had the most intellectually powerful role in the entire Wehrmacht. He wasn't in charge of troops on the ground, but he was the mind shaping everything from battle plans to training to long-term strategy. If Germany's military had a brain, Beck was it. He worked long hours, often arriving early and leaving late, and he didn't care much for the trappings of power. His home in the quiet Berlin neighborhood of Lichterfelde was simple, just like his daily routine. He wasn't interested in showing off or playing politics. What mattered to Beck was detail, accuracy, structure, and the kind of careful planning that didn't leave room for surprises. While some of his colleagues quietly complained that he was obsessed over paperwork, None of them could deny he was one of the sharpest minds the army had. At first, Beck didn't oppose the Nazi regime. Like many others in the military, he welcomed the idea of a stronger, more stable Germany. After years of political chaos under the Weimar Republic, the new government seemed like a path back to order. In fact, Beck had even publicly defended the Nazi Party back in 1930, when 3 army officers were on trial for secretly joining it. Military rules banned political affiliations, but Beck argued that the party represented a real force in German society and that banning its members made no sense. He wasn't a Nazi himself, but he didn't see them as a threat, at least not yet. When Hitler merged the role of president and chancellor after Hindenburg's death in 1934, giving himself full control of the military, Beck called it a good thing for the army. And in those early days, many officers agreed with him. They believed that the authoritarian rule, while harsh, could bring the discipline and unity that democracy had failed to provide. But Beck's support for Hitler had limits, and by 1934, those limits were starting to show. After the Nazis failed in their attempt to take over Austria, Beck grew uneasy. He warned that Germany was playing with fire. While he didn't object to rearming the country, in fact, he was often more aggressive than Hitler when it came to expanding the army. He believed any military action had to be backed by solid planning and strong alliances. And as he watched Hitler's moves more closely, he began to see a dangerous pattern. Hitler wasn't thinking like a general. He was acting on impulse, fueled by ideology instead of strategy. Beck didn't just sit with his concerns, he acted on them. Quietly, he began building his own network of trusted contacts. He relied on military attachés working in foreign countries to report back on what they saw and heard. Sometimes, these officers passed on critical information. Other times, Beck used the same network to leak warnings outside Germany. He also started bringing civilians into his circle, most notably Karl Gordeler, a respected conservative figure and former mayor of Leipzig. Gordeler, like Beck, believed Germany was heading in the wrong direction. Together, they hoped to offer a more rational long-term path forward. Beck understood that the problems facing Germany couldn't be solved by force alone. He wanted real solutions, not propaganda. By 1937, Beck's quiet concerns had hardened into open disagreement. That year, he was told to begin drawing up the military orders for Fall Otto, the plan to invade Austria, but Beck pushed back. It wasn't that he disagreed with the idea of Austria joining Germany. What troubled him was the timing. He believed Germany simply wasn't ready. If the invasion triggered resistance from other European powers, they could be drawn into a conflict they weren't equipped to survive. Hitler didn't care. He went ahead anyway. In March 1938, Austria was annexed. The world didn't intervene, and Beck, outnumbered and overruled, signed the documents. But the incident changed him. Watching Hitler ignore every military warning confirmed what Beck had begun to suspect. The Fuhrer didn't want advice. He wanted obedience. The next crisis came quickly. Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia, claiming ethnic Germans were being mistreated. But Beck didn't buy it. He studied the situation in detail and saw only danger ahead. Czechoslovakia had a well-trained army and a solid defense network. France had promised to protect them. Britain wouldn't stay out of it, and Japan, Germany's hoped-for ally, was locked in a brutal war in China and couldn't offer support. On top of that, Beck knew Germany's economy was fragile. Resources were already stretched thin, and a prolonged war would push the country past its limits. If Hitler moved forward, Germany wasn't just picking a fight. It was betting everything on a gamble it was likely to lose. So Beck did what he knew best. He wrote. In May 1938, he began drafting a series of memoranda, laying out exactly why Germany was unprepared. These weren't emotional pleas or moral arguments. They were cold, detailed assessments backed by facts. Beck compared Germany's situation to the final years of World War I and argued that it was, in many ways, even worse now. He explained that France still had the strongest army in Europe, and that Britain, despite recent hesitation, would almost certainly join the fight. He pushed back against the dangerous belief, common in Hitler's circle, that Britain would remain neutral in a local conflict. In Beck's view, this wasn't just bad advice, it was a fantasy. And in war, fantasy led to failure. Beck didn't stop at writing memos. When his warnings fell on deaf ears, he took things a step further. He went to General Brauchitsch with an idea that was bold, risky, and possibly huge. What if every top general resigned at the same time? Not a rebellion, not a violent takeover, just a unified refusal to support Hitler's push toward war. Beck believed that if the entire military leadership stepped down together, Hitler would have no choice but to pause. It was a final attempt to bring the madness to a halt using pressure, not weapons. But the other generals weren't willing. Some were too scared to go against the regime. Others didn't want to risk their careers. And many, sadly, were loyal to Hitler's vision. Beck was left on his own. In early August 1938, Hitler called a meeting with his top generals. Beck laid out his concerns one more time. Hitler, confident and aggressive, tore into his arguments and painted him as weak and defeatist. Most of the room turned against him. The generals who might have stood by Beck instead stood with Hitler. And just like that, Beck knew he had lost. On August 18th, he officially resigned. It was a quiet exit. No speeches, no drama. Hitler asked him to keep it discreet, and in return, promised him a high-ranking field position. That position never came. Instead, Beck was quietly moved into retirement, removed from the army he had spent his life building. But that wasn't the end of his story. Beck didn't leave because he was giving up. He left because he was ready to fight a different kind of battle. The man who had once shaped Germany's military doctrine was now preparing to take a stand against the very regime he had once served, not with bullets or commands, but with resistance. Was Ludwig Beck a patriot, a traitor, or something much more complicated? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from history.